human people. Welcome back to Some of Us. This is Andrew's second episode where we're going to be talking about political correctness and free speech and some other very controversial things. So we know a lot about you at this point, Andrew, don't you think?
I would hope so. I think the first episode covered as many broad strokes as we could get to.
Okay, so in that case, I am just going to get the ball rolling with a couple of questions, and then we can talk about, we can debate a little bit more in depth.
Cool.
So, I would like you to give me 3 short definitions.
Okay.
So the first one of political correctness, the second one of free speech, and the third one about respect. So what are your definitions of those 3 things?
Okay. Obviously these are going to be butchered and they're not going to be on the spot. They're not going to be anything near what they probably are, but I'm going to give you what I view them.
Yeah, that's
as.
what. Yeah.
So respect to me is pretty easy, because respect is if you are somebody who has I'm trying to think about how to word this. So if you're somebody who has any sort of features or aspects to yourself that are not, assuming that you're not threatening or hostile, any aspects that are valuable or kind, you should be treated in a certain manner that suits what you are capable of. So it is something that all humans get and have, but has varying levels to it. I.e., PhDs get slightly more respect than masters, blah, 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 blah. That's the simplified version of it.
So this is your definition of...
Respect.
Yeah,
okay. Sorry, I switched the order.
Yeah.
And then political correctness is society's way of controlling and focusing on issues of aggressive speech patterns towards certain groups of people. Originally considered just in the way democracy works, that you can say whatever you wanted to keep order. Now it's kind of spread into worldwide culture and people everywhere kind of follow it. And then the last one was free speech. So free speech is the ability given to you by where you live to express yourself in any manner that you would like to, regardless of anything. Just you have the ability to express yourself how you please.
Okay, so you see political correctness and free speech as opposites?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think they're exact opposites, but because the exact opposite of free speech would be absolute controlled speech. But political correctness is regulated speech, which is not what free speech is.
So what ways do you see either individuals or groups or even governments or industries imposing political correctness and detracting from free speech?
Well, I really don't like that people are still calling it political correctness, because a lot of the ways people shut down speech that isn't even offensive or in any facet, just public speakers they don't like, no matter what the talk is about, has become very radicalized and kind of just a mob mentality way. But so the government regulates it by covering things like slander, and they have, in Canada, we have hate speech laws, which means you can't target somebody for something they can't change, and then with slander you can't accuse a figurehead of anything that is untrue. Which those are very subjective. Those are very subjective criteria to regulate speech on. It really comes down to what an individual interprets words as, and that's something that the original speaker can't always control. The mob, or the general public, kind of controls speech by just if the most amount of people are offended by it, they shun and attack somebody who says or expresses beliefs they don't like, with the intention of making them stop. which it's a thing humans have done for a very long period of time. It's a habit to form mobs to shut down individuals you don't like.
Absolutely. To use I would say a common trope in the discussions of political correctness versus free speech, or maybe the term wokeness, as is used very often right now, is,
I like sleepness.
is the protest versus counter protest.
Yep.
So it's the idea that if there is maybe, let's say, a right-wing figurehead that is speaking or in a public setting, and a mob forms around this person to protest them and to say, hey, we don't like you and we don't think you should be here, or we believe that the things you are saying is basically counterintuitive to I don't know, I want to say
our society?
Yeah, I want to say human existence as it stands right now. Don't you think that is part of free speech?
The right to protest?
Yeah.
Yes. And so the thing that gets tricky about the legal aspects of free speech is that it only protects the individual from government and organizations, so that industry cannot shut down an individual's free speech. Well, actually, it gets tricky in industry, but government cannot suppress an individual's free speech, but individuals are allowed to suppress other people's free speech. Thus, the protest is allowed, because it's just a group of individuals collectively drowning out another individual. While I do think that technically there is no legal way of stopping that, so I do think it should be allowed, because it's more immoral to restrict what people are allowed to gather where and do what. I do believe that it's incredibly immoral to drown out anybody's voice, because if it was somebody from the left speaking, it would be viewed as shutting down progress, in air quotes. And it's really just people being prejudiced about what they believe, in their opinion, is correct. And, I hate being the guy who always goes back to the Nazi example, but that's what the brown shirts were, is they believed in a political party, so they shut down all the other political parties' rallies and stopped anything from happening. So just because you don't agree with someone and you think it isn't in the best interest of humanity doesn't make it not. It makes you differing in opinions. So I say it's a very dangerous route to go down, to be allowed to shut down people who are speaking, even if you think it's horrible.
So are you more anti protest in that sense?
What do you mean anti-protest?
So,
I don't think protest should be allowed?
Or you see the problem with the debate around free speech, or with the different kinds of expressions that we have right now, has more to do with the way that we enact protests.
Yeah, I guess a little way. I think protests are pretty ineffective historically, and so people have been ramping them up to make them more effective, but all this does is it creates wherever there are the most people, that's what's correct, because it's, if there's 50 people in a room and 45 of them are leftist, air quotes, and 5 are right, well, that in that room, the left is what is correct. But if you do the opposite, it's the right is correct. And so now you have these mass halls where public speakers go, where it's a quote-unquote right-wing speaker, so it's only people from the right in there. And then in another hall, there's a left-wing speaker, so there's only people from the left in there, unless there's a protest. So it's really, the groups never sit down with each other anymore and have civil discussion they never have civil discussion. The only time they mix is when there's a protest, and then people get upset when there's a counter-protest.
I mean, that also, I think, has to do with violence, which I think we'll touch on a little bit later. That did remind me of, I think part of, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna, kind of speak and lead you into the next kind of thing that we're talking about. Okay. I think the nature of now is that, like, we don't see protests the same way as we used to. Like, there was a long time where it's like you talk about the French Revolution and how, like, protest was an amazing tool to, like, bring democracy and shut down a corrupt society, whereas now, like, it seems like everybody is protesting, and we kind of exist in a state of identity politics and unrest, and
it's almost as if the movements they're protesting aren't as important as democracy.
Well, okay, that leads us to talking a little bit more about the legal system in Canada when it comes to propaganda, hate speech, political correctness within, like, the court system and the judicial system and our rights framework that we have in Canada. So, firstly, I want to ask you, do you see the discussions that are going on in the public forum about free speech, do you think they're reflected in the way that the legal system works? Like, do you see it the same as, like, discussions about free speech and legislation that has to do with, like, cases where free speech have been breached are done the same way within, like, the court system as they are done in the public forum? Like,
are you talking about in Canada or just worldwide?
I would say more closely in Canada because we live in Canada.
So Canada doesn't have free speech. It never has. Not in a legal sense. It's not. We don't have
it in a legislative sense. In a legal sense, it is protected, and I can talk about why.
Well, I caution you. I don't know what you prepared because obviously we don't do research together. But I don't know if you have prepped the argument about, like, media. Because if the media is not allowed to be free, which people don't understand, the Prime Minister is allowed to veto certain publications, then by default, no individual can have free speech. Because organizations are essentially individual creations.
I mean, here.
And a lot of this has to do with what the power of an individual's speech is. So, like, a lot of people obviously, like, have the ability to express themselves and their opinions, but they don't feel like anyone's listening. So that has to be taken into account of what the modern definition of free speech is. I guess entitlement to platform.
So the information that I found is a little vague when it comes to how the media deals with it, but the way that legislation and the courts tend to separate the existence of free speech and the need for, or like the protection from discrimination is if there is proven, willful, and deliberate acts of hatred that are associated with it.
So they're enforcing the acts of hatred, not the words of hatred.
Well, I wouldn't, like, why would you say that's true?
Well, because if there's actions, then obviously it's not hate speech, it's hate action.
Well,
there's a big difference. Hate
action comes in the form of propaganda, which exists within the media, outside of the media. Now we have the internet, which is like a mostly uncensored public forum for discussion. The point is that even if those things exist, they cannot necessarily be properly they cannot be sentenced for unless you can actually prove the intent, the willful intent to harm and discriminate against. And this comes even in the discussion of genocide within Canada. So if we, for some reason, need to make a ruling that has to do with the existence of a genocide somewhere in the world, that ruling will have to go through a process that is that is part of our legislation, which discusses person to person, obviously in the courts, the willful, proven existence of harm. And that is actually very hard to rule on.
Yeah, it's completely subjective, which is the problem. You're having
okay.
two people, one of which is saying that they're offended, and then the third person has to decide if that offense is valid.
So
You have three people's opinions to decide if somebody gets in trouble or not. That's a really dangerous line. The problem with words is that their interpretation is always stuck. It will never be perfect between the speaker and the listener. And so, to punish somebody for speaking or expressing in any manner, what you're doing is you're punishing insufficient communication skills.
absolutely, but within Canada, in order to target someone for hate speech, they basically have to admit it. Like, you cannot put a person in jail for hate speech unless they say, hi, I am part of this group, or I'm not part of this group. I'm an independent actor, and I said this because I am inciting hate towards this group.
Yeah, but that's the same thing as somebody being like, I'm going to fucking kill you.
Okay, explain that to me.
There's a difference between vague discrimination or discomfort or offense and a direct threat. Now, threat can come at the destruction of one's character, the assault of one physically, the financial ruin. Like, there's many different ways to tear someone down in modern society, and any of those, I do absolutely agree, should be punishable. So if somebody has words where they have said that they are going to do something like this, and they historically have done, or are probably going to with evidence of a lined-up plan, I don't see that as punishing hate speech. You're punishing aggressive actions towards another individual, which are absolutely necessary. If you find a dude making a bomb, you don't wait for him to make it to stop him. You don't wait for him to be like, hi, yes, I'm going to blow something up. You arrest him and you do whatever you need to do. If someone's like, hey, I fucking hate those people and I'm going to kill them, you don't wait around to see if he's going to do it. That's not hate speech. That's a threat.
I mean, but those two things are very similar, don't you think?
Not at all.
Okay.
I hate black people and I want to kill black people are two very different things.
Okay, why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because you don't have to like everybody, but you don't go around killing the people you don't like.
I mean, you don't necessarily think the term I hate insert group of person here to be offensive?
Offensive, sure, but can we legislate that? No.
I mean,
I'm never going to argue that it's not offensive. If you're offended by something, you are absolutely allowed to be offended by something. But what you can't do is put someone in jail for it or fine them for it.
okay, so why don't you think that or at least what I've described from the Canadian legal system to you would mean that they're not being careful of like the existence of free expression? Because yes, you are allowed to say that, and yes, you are going to be shunned for it, because people also have to protect their own free speech.
That's the punishment, is being shunned. We should let people say whatever they want, and the punishment from society is you leave crazy alone.
I mean, that just seems like a different form of the social contract that already exists, where it's like, if you do something outside of the group, then the group will no longer see you as part of them.
That's how it works with every animal culture ever out there. Shunning is the ultimate form of you not being allowed to live. The only difference is that in human society, shunning doesn't kill you anymore. Because in the past, if you did something like that, you died because you got left alone. The difference is that we have such established society that it just means they go mope and then probably radicalized because they've been stuck in their basement reading propaganda.
I mean, I would say that that's like a very or like a discussed argument within people who are anti-political correctness, is that it's sort of like the survival of the strong and the failure of the weak.
And the ones who don't work with others well are the ones who are considered the weak in most of nature.
Okay, I would like to ask you why you think that our psychological process of natural selection is more valuable, more able to function, and more efficient, or binding than the legal system protecting groups of people from discrimination.
This, I don't know why, but this made me think of a meme where it's like hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection, and it's like a picture of a wolf, and then it's like a few hundred years of human breeding the traits they deem most optimal, and it's like a pug that can't breathe.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of evidence that you don't fix what's broken or what's not broken, and nature seems to do a pretty damn good job at picking the traits that do best. But whenever humans try and figure out what's best for us, and we take the philosophical route, shit gets pretty wonky, huh? The whole idea of like sustaining a massive society where all humans get to be individuals but also be protected, and like there's never going to be a society where you can have more than like 10 people in a room, even then you're stretching it, where everyone's going to get along.
I mean, but I feel like that points back to your definition of respect, which is it's something that is earned, and it is something that is based on your status.
Yeah, and if you haven't earned any respect, then what? Who cares what you say? You don't have any respect. There's no reason for us to listen to you.
Okay.
But also, if you protest the people who have no respect, you're lowering yourself to their level.
So, in that case, what would stop you from just like inciting hate speech? Like what about your, or maybe not what about your beliefs, but like what about the dislike of political correctness does not want to make you be like this naked guy with like a like a cardboard thing saying I hate everybody, yeah. Like and just like, you know, saying racially charged things to, or like any kind of group of people ever. Like what is stopping you from,
like me personally, just an individual?
I would say you personally, but also like I just kind of, I guess I want to know like what separates you or what separates people like you from the people who do end up using propaganda to harm individuals, groups.
Well, I mean, so there's a very deep-seated...
Like, if it's not respect...
It is respect. I hold myself to a higher respect. To
Okay.
them, the destruction or offending of another group is more important than their own decency. And that's an innate issue that has to do with, like, their upbringing, like, their socioeconomic status, like, so many things about, like, how they interpret information. Because people who get stuck in a basement and just view propaganda all the time get brainwashed.
Mm-hmm.
I am obviously in a situation where I was stuck in my basement for a very long time in high school, just, you know, because that's what teenage boys do.
Mm-hmm.
But I viewed probably millions of different pieces of propaganda and information from both sides, but I'm in the situation where I had a good friend group and support group where I could talk about them and influence them and form my own opinions and become respected in the sense that I have become an informed individual.
Right. So, in a sense, correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the sense that you're saying that what is more important than, like, PC culture is to be able to, basically not live in an echo chamber or a bubble and be able to engage with society about these issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's not how... I guess I would phrase it as, like... I don't want to say it like that. I was going to say it doesn't matter if you're right, because if everyone else thinks you're wrong, you're wrong. Mm. But the reality is like, it doesn't matter what your opinion is. If everyone else is disagreeing with you, you're clearly the reject.
I mean, I don't know why that would be important.
Why is that?
Can you explain that to me?
Because social structure is the most important thing to every species, and definitely humans.
Okay, so imagine this. The social structure is now saying, hey, the shit we talk about and the way we talk about it, especially when we talk about certain people, whether it comes to race, gender, sexuality...
I think I know where you're going with this, and I urge you not to.
Okay, well, I want to hear what you have to say about it.
Okay.
Because...
Were you going to go down the road that, like, if a large amount of people are saying that this is the way it should be, isn't that the way it should go?
I mean, what, like, essentially, yeah, like, what would stop you from... not what would stop you from agreeing them, because obviously we're all people who form our own opinions and all of that, but, like, what about the current social order in certain pockets to you denounces, like, this natural selection, I guess?
Because I don't denounce it, because the reality is, it is not the people who are most liked by the group that are correct. It is the people who understand the opinions of the reject while being accepted by the group.
Okay.
That make the difference. The people who advanced society were not the priests in medieval Europe that blindly followed God they'd been taught their whole lives, but they were also not the heretics screaming at the doors to burn the church down. They were the people who went to Sunday Mass, but also thought that there might have been another answer. If you are too friendly with the group, you believe that everyone is with you, and you become brainwashed, because you are now accepting the opinions of everyone, because that validates you.
Okay.
And that's just as dangerous as not being validated at all, because being over-validated is giving you respect you do not deserve.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a very politically charged, very controversial question.
Nice.
And you don't have to answer it.
I will answer everything.
Cool. So...
if I can.
When you're talking about this, are you speaking for communities maybe of POC, maybe people who are LGBTQ, people who are racialized or marginalized? Do you think that, like, you can apply that logic to them? I mean, if we're using the term them, which is a very not cool term.
You people?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you mean? Like, what do you mean, can I apply it to
I just
them?
mean, like, are you speaking for them, basically?
Aren't they also human?
They're definitely also human. But, like, if I'm to use the framework that being a racialized person means you have to deal with very different, like, psychological group issues.
Okay.
Like, do you think that your ideas come from a place of privilege?
Absolutely, but
yeah.
That doesn't make them wrong. And so what's important to remember is that progress does not come because we demand it. Progress comes because we create an environment where it can naturally happen.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get rid of racism and segregation and all of that by demanding it happen. What actually happens is you surround people with different people of different races, different religions, different ethnicities, and the first 3 generations that are exposed to this will hate each other and try and kill each other and do everything in their power to have the us versus them mentality.
Mm-hmm.
But their children will grow up with it being completely normal, and as long as you educate them properly, it gradually goes away. The first 3 generations have to suffer if you want improvement. You do not get to say, we would like Muslims in North America to stop being discriminated against. They're moving here. The first group are going to be discriminated against. You cannot fix that. You cannot stop that. But they're moving here because it gives their children a better life, and that's what's the point. And that's more important. So leave it alone. It'll go away. As long as you mind that it doesn't get too violent, you educate people on why it's okay, and you just let it sit. Because normal is what makes things happen.
I mean, don't you think that that ideal of normalcy is created in part by the existence of legislation that protects people?
Not at all. Only if it's protecting them from violence.
Well, I mean, I think that that's what the judicial system in Canada is trying to do, is protecting them not just from physical violence, but also psychological violence, or propaganda and brainwash individuals who incite violence.
But you can't do anything of discomfort like move to a new country where people are different from you without having psychological damage.
Absolutely, which is why...
So we can only protect them from violence so much. They are innately making choices that are going to cause psychological damage to them. And we have to let them do that because that's free. That's freedom. And I'm fine with the law that you've cited about the stopping of people who have actions connected to what they are saying, because I agree with that, absolutely. But something like Bill C-16, which is the notorious debate in Canada, for those who don't know, it has to do, I mean, I can't cite its specifics, but it's mainly about the speech in someone in relation to their sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, all of those things, and that you can't discriminate someone in conversation or in official speak, which I don't always know what that means, but I generally picture it as like a workplace environment is where it's strongest. It's like very little will someone say something on the street and get punished for it. But that's dangerous, because if somebody wants to discriminate against those people, we're not going to dig through their brain and fix that. Like, all they're going to do is be quiet and bitter about those opinions now. So even if you can punish them for it, all you're doing is radicalizing that group further. Which is more dangerous for the people you're trying to protect. Mm-hmm. Especially if they're minorities. Because then they're outnumbered. That's
very interesting.
So...
Okay, wow. So we're going right into Bill C-16.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was inevitable.
Of course. So I actually have it pulled up here.
Of course you do.
And I'll just read a section of it, of why they introduced Bill C-16. It's, this enactment amends the Human Rights Act to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination. The enactment also amends the criminal code to extend the protection against hate propaganda set out in that act to any section of the public that is distinguished by gender identity or expression, and to clearly set out that evidence that an offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on gender identity or expression constitutes an aggravating circumstance that a court must take into consideration when it imposes a sentence.
Okay.
So...
That's horrible.
So,
I put out a flyer for a straight white males gathering only. That is clearly discriminatory to every other group because they are not allowed to attend. That's a safe space.
I mean, as long as you're not saying, like, F insert slur here because they deserve to die. Like,
that's not what that said.
No. You putting out a flyer that says, like on the University of Ottawa campus, they literally have, they have posters that say young conservatives meetup. So they have, like, a meeting. I think it's like twice a month, and that is completely allowed. It's allowed within this act. All it's doing is it's amending the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code to include gender identity within the grounds for consideration when it comes to, like, already established cases of hate speech, propaganda, violence, or the presence of genocide.
Once again, if there's already grounds present for violence, you're not stopping speech, you're stopping the communication of violence.
But
that's a different thing.
I think that's...
That's not what propaganda is. Propaganda is the purpose spread of untrue information.
I'm trying to say that it's
black people are inferior, Muslims are all evil. That's clearly the spread of incorrect information.
I mean, but no one is... Like, I don't necessarily see the stopping of free information that's being possessed. I think, like, even the criminal code is set up to, you have to have a discussion among people in the courts that are able to prove premeditated, willful ignorance and hate, which leads to violence, whether it's psychological or physical. So Canada, what essentially they're doing is they're setting up a framework so that the discussion can happen. And you still, my research at least, has shown that in any case of hate speech, you have to get the literal Attorney Generals of Canada to come and discuss and debate whether or not this constitutes grounds for hate speech in the first place. So essentially, or at least I'm arguing, that Canada does not try to impede free speech. What they're trying to do is make it easier to discuss hate speech, free speech, political correctness in a judicial context when there are cases coming into courts that have to do with discrimination.
Does it cover political orientation?
Political orientation?
Like, based on your political affiliation, can you not be discriminated against?
I mean, I think, like, that is grounded in democracy.
So if somebody says kill all racists, is that hate speech? And should it be charged as such?
I mean, within Canada, if we're using the framework, if it can be proven and it is willful and it has caused harm, then
Someone's
yes.
an Antifa member, they actively show up to protest anybody from the alt-right, and they actively post frequently on Twitter saying that we should kill all people who have this opinion. Should this person be locked up?
Absolutely.
Okay. Canada does not do this. It is entirely prejudiced towards the right, or towards the left.
Why do you think that?
Why do I think that? It's evidence. Have you ever seen Antifa be shut down the way that somebody like, well, the KKK is irrelevant in Canada, so I don't want to use them, but like, I don't know what a good example would be. But I think that's common knowledge. I don't see any oppression of the left's ability to segregate itself from other people. They constantly attack people of the right and limit their speech.
Okay, how do they limit their speech?
By attending rallies in mobs. Basically having Twitter power by creating laws like this.
I mean, but
I think you should have the right to gather and talk about whatever you want to talk about.
But
as long as there isn't violence.
What we're saying is that you do.
No, you don't. You think people would be allowed to host a KKK rally?
Technically, you should be able to.
Technically.
As
but
long
in
as
practice,
there is no
it's not. So
violence.
I'm saying the legality of it is not actually what's upheld. Just like how we talked in my first episode about the Quebec's legislation about the religious idols.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that if it was actually upheld the way that it is written, it's a great law. But if that's not what happens in practice, that's the same thing with this law. It's clearly biased.
I mean, why don't you see that as right-wing groups getting shunned for what they believe? Because if
I do, but they have the right to be in groups while they're getting shunned. And they have the right to say what they believe, so we continue to shun them. I support their right to have prejudice against people as long as there's no violence.
Okay,
you do not have to like everyone.
Don't you think people have the right also to say prejudice sucks?
Fuck yeah, you do. But you can't stop it.
Okay, so
straight men don't date men because they are prejudiced. That's how prejudice works. You discriminate against people in every aspect of your life. Somebody gives you a bad feeling, you don't be friends with them. That's prejudice. You just, every interaction you have in society, you get a certain kind of coffee because a different coffee shop is something that you don't like based on what kind of cups they use, what kind of straws they have. A guy treated you wrong when you worked there. There's not enough tables. That's prejudice. It's how you interpret information and then what factors are most important to you.
I mean, what about the difference? Like, don't you think there's a different connotation between, like, coffee and racism? Like, I think there's a very big
You can get
difference.
it black or white.
But I mean, like, fundamentally.
Obviously, but it's an analogy, and it's not wrong. If to somebody, the important deciding factor of who they want to associate with and who they deem is important is the simple skin color, which we know does not impact who you are as a person, they're allowed to believe that. Just like for somebody, if they want to decide that who they only want to associate is other people who believe in the same God as them, they're allowed to do that.
I mean,
like, okay, by the logic, you shouldn't be able to express religious beliefs anywhere because it impedes certain other people's religious beliefs to not be exposed to that.
So you believe that we need to just handle
suck it up.
harm that we face?
Yeah.
Okay, and what
conflict means growth.
What benefit does that have to society? Of just like sucking it up and handling it? Like, in that sense, how do you make it either go away or not exist as prevalently in society?
It'll never go away, but it naturally idealizes and builds up the people who are capable of doing that, and they get the respect that they deserve. They're dignified. And so society naturally values the people who are best at doing that. And so you build a society where the culture rotates around the people who are most self-capable and don't bend to the opinions of others.
I mean, don't you think... Okay, do you think that sounds like we're just doing nothing? Like, with that solution, what we're doing is you're holding your hands up, you're saying, this is not my problem.
Yeah, nature built the tiger by doing nothing. It just let the things that happen to be the best naturally find the way. A river forms by following the path of least resistance.
Don't you think that has consequences for certain people?
For now, but that's the point. You leave it alone until the natural best thing happens, and it could take 1,000 years, but if that's what it takes, that's what it takes.
Okay, so we're going to go back to the French Revolution. How long would it have taken the French, had they not had their revolution, to have the creation of a republic, democratic society?
That's a different thing, because now you're nitpicking that that's a society that wasn't letting that happen either. So what they did is they took it into their own hands to create a society where it's possible to let that happen, which is what democracy is, because everyone gets free will. You can't have a culture that lets the natural order go without free will, but you also have to make sure not to let someone's free will put you back into a state where you can't let that happen. It's tricky. I'm not saying it's easy. That's what the difficult part is the deep philosophical aspect of it. It's because you need to all be on a cultural understanding of that, which is impossible.
Okay, so I have 2 questions then.
Yeah.
The first one is, how can you, as an individual, take the steps that you want to aid in the creation of the society that you're talking about? And the second one is, has there ever been, and you don't have to answer this, has there ever been a situation where you have been discriminated against because of either your identity or because of your beliefs?
Okay. So first one was, what can an individual do? Do you mean like me, or like just what advice I would give to any individual?
I'm talking first and foremost about you personally.
Okay.
But if you want to add things, like if you want to add little tidbits of advice or information, you can definitely do that.
So the most important thing to me about what you can do as an individual to help create this culture, and, well, most importantly, comfort yourself and build your own self-awareness about like who you are and like what forms you, is to allow as many people as possible to have opinions on you and to say them, but then absorb that information and sit back and think about which ones actually affect you, are actually important to you. I.e., your family and your close friends' opinions are obviously much more valuable because they know more about you. They've spent more time with you. It's more accurate. So you should listen to them more because of that. But you shouldn't exclusively listen to them because they're also biased and prejudiced towards you. They are affectionate towards you. They want to say good things about you. Thus, it's not true. If a stranger yells, "fuck you," you're a bad person on the street, do you listen to them? Probably not. Because who the fuck cares? Why this person doesn't know you? They don't know anything you've done. But if your family tells you're a bad person, you might want to take a step back and think about the fact that maybe you're doing actions that are scaring people and that this is the effect that you're having on society. And if every individual does this, then you start listening to the people who say bad things about you, but that's how you fix them. You need to be aware of them. So if you're only surrounding yourself by people who say good things about you, you're never going to see the other side of yourself, which is a very important thing. Because if you think you're perfect, that's what maturity is knowing that you're not perfect and always trying to improve. Because if you get stuck, you're no use to anybody. Because then you've decided, this is who I am, this is my values, this is what I'm going to do, and you never change, and you're just going to do the same thing over and over again. That's not useful. Society can't use that.
Can I interject with a question?
Sure.
Before you answer the other one? Do you believe that there are people who are more subject to hatred than others? Whether
like
it's,
innately or just in our society?
I mean, like socioeconomic status.
Absolutely.
Marginalization.
Well, I mean, yeah, historically, racism,
Yeah.
religious discrimination, the Jews would probably take the cake on that one.
Mm.
Yeah, obviously there's people who receive more. I think it shifts every decade or so to switch to a new group or so. Like, obviously it was black people in America for, like, the longest period of time. Before that, it was Native Americans. Before that, it was, like, the Irish and the Scottish and the Jews. And before that, it was the Irish, the Scottish, and the Jews. And then before that, it was the English by the Vikings. And, like, you can go back forever. And when it was in Egypt, it was the Jews.
I mean, you can also talk about indigenous people.
That's what I said. It was Native Americans before it was before there was a single black person in America. The Native American population had been absolutely annihilated. And you like, even calling it racism or discrimination is like a delicate thing because it was so back in that ideology that there was not even a second thought about it. So, like, nowadays we look back in hindsight and we're like, well, that was racist and discriminatory and all that, and we're like, yeah. Because nowadays we hold value to ethnic groups, whereas people didn't do that back then.
There is a kind of strain in history, at least like the study, just because I'm familiar with that, where it's like you can't demonize people in history for doing and saying racist things because we can't impose a moral judgment on things that happened.
Well, yeah, it's more important, like, they didn't have the same information we had, so they had to make actions based on that. It's not that they weren't wrong, because in hindsight we know they're wrong, but do you ever think back to something you did when you were a 13-year-old teenager and you're like, wow, that was fucking stupid? Yeah, that's how history works, is like, you're gonna make decisions, but those decisions led to our growth now. It's only because we could look back on them and call them wrong that we know not to do it again.
But now, like, doesn't that mean the result of that knowledge is to make changes? And to use an argument
But the changes happen naturally. We saw that happen and we went, we're not going to let that happen again. And so it didn't. There was no government figure that went, you're not allowed to let this happen again. Lincoln didn't free the slaves despite everyone's belief. He just didn't like the South's economics.
That is true.
Yeah. There was no omnipotent figure that went, slavery's over today, because there's still like 43 million slaves in the world. They're just not in America, and nobody talks about them. But those are in countries where we can't control things because there's not a culture about it. The only government intervention that we could do there would be to send military forces, and that's something people often don't like.
Okay, so can I just posit something?
Sure.
So Ben Shapiro, whose arguments I know you're familiar with.
Yes.
He says,
very outspoken.
He says something where he says, of course racism exists and discrimination exists. It's just not institutional.
Not anymore. I believe that it has been for most of history, but I would say in the last, well, now that we're in 2022 decades or so, it's been, if it's institutional in any way, it's very, very light. And I would make arguments that it's not institutional, at least in North America and parts of Europe.
I'm sure that could be argued.
Anything can be argued.
Anything could be argued. That's kind of the point of the show.
I am advocating that people should be allowed to argue that black people are inferior. They will just always lose that argument.
Okay, so if I can use Ben Shapiro's argument to say, with his knowledge that racism and discrimination,
as a Jew, mind you,
will always exist.
Yeah.
Don't you think that it is a responsible step for the Canadian judicial and legal system to consider racism and discrimination as something to watch out for and to be able to discuss it within their proceedings? Because it is part of society, and it seems like sometimes it's inextricable whether you think it's institutional or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like the biggest thing that society and the government needs to be aware of is to play its part in making sure that, so I understand that by allowing radical groups on either side to meet, you are allowing them to have their own echo chamber, which is preventing them from like sending propaganda out because they're allowed to meet, and that's their free speech, and that's why we support that. But you need to make sure it doesn't become steps towards violence. So it's a near impossible thing to do without holding everyone's identity and like surveilling them and all of that. But keeping tabs on that, like fucking undercover police officers or whatever you want, whatever you deem, that is something that I understand is a problem. That if you let certain groups of people get together, they will build the us versus them mentality. So every now and again, it needs to be kind of like cracked like an egg and let out. But you can't stop them from being allowed to do that. You have to wait for them to be a danger.
But, I mean, I feel like that, in a way, is what the judicial system is doing.
It's not, though. It's preventing the meetings from ever happening, which also prevents people who will never be a danger from meeting and talking like that. Because I, for one, who am somebody who I like to believe that I'm not a racist, not a bigot, not biased or overly biased in any way, love to sit down with people who have those views and talk like I agree with them for a good hour or so. Because it shows tremendous value to me in understanding how their brain works. And the only true way to ever change their minds is to understand the way they think and why they're prioritizing
Absolutely.
the things that they do. And if you can't understand that, you'll never get rid of racism. Not that I think it ever will happen. But clearly, putting them, like, locking them all away and doing all that, all it does is make the people who didn't agree with them but kind of sympathized with them now not like you. And now they're radical. And then their friends are radical. And so forth. And then you really have an us versus them mentality because the government picked sides. And that shouldn't happen.
Okay. So, a couple things I want to kind of bring to light.
Do we need to bounce back to the question that never got answered?
I am going to go.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So, I do feel like I'm sort of hearing from you a little bit of the argument I've heard from Stephen Fry before.
Oh, yeah?
Which is political correctness doesn't work because what they call us doesn't matter. It's how they treat us.
Yes.
And
that's a great argument.
There's definitely something to be said for that. Especially if political correctness, what it's doing is just policing language.
Yeah.
But I do feel like a lot of what happens between the two sides is they nitpick, this is a thing that you do to each other, and it kind of, it stops the ability of people to be able to speak to one another in the first place. And that is something that, okay, I'm going to say, do you think that is something that a democratic country should value? Is like watching or keeping tabs on or discussing groups who are close to violence, probably just because of the lived experiences they've had.
Absolutely. I mean, to press another hot key, like Charlottesville.
Yeah.
Very notorious incident that just happened. Well, actually, it was like a few years ago, I guess now.
I think it was a year or two ago.
I'm pretty sure it was like 2017, 2018.
I think it was 2018.
Yeah. Where there was a permitted protest of gun rights activists, many of whom could be called far right wing. I wouldn't call them alt-righters. I wouldn't call them radicals, but I would call them definitely strong-leaning right supporters. Organized a march. Government knew about it. There should have been a little bit more foresight in expecting the kind of backlash that the left had towards that. One of the biggest problems with what happened in that city is that there wasn't enough police that were well equipped enough to handle the sheer population of what went on. They took into account that there might be locals from the left attending, but they didn't take into account the nearby big cities where people would drive from, because that's how passionate people are nowadays. And so there wasn't sufficient resources and manpower or equipment to handle riots on that scale, and that's why the violence escalated the way it did. Is because you had the two sides interacting with each other without interference, which is a very dangerous thing. There needs to be a bystander or like a third party, which is what the court systems are supposed to be. But they didn't have a choice in whether they wanted to pick sides or not because they weren't even equipped or not. So there was no right or wrong. There was just free reign. We don't know who started the violence first because it's so undocumented. But if there'd been sufficient police officers there, we would know. And that's what's important.
I feel like we need to acknowledge the fact that a man in a car driving at a very high speed in the middle of a crowd of people managed to kill a woman.
Yeah. Why did he feel a need to? Did he feel that maybe a group of his friends who had taken a legal process to protest something they strongly believed in was being surrounded by a mob 3 times their number, and maybe he felt like violence had started because gates were being knocked down and people were being shoved and threats were being thrown, and so he, as a radical, decided that it was important to do that?
Is that right?
Absolutely not. But can you understand why? Maybe we need to sympathize with that man a little bit because he was left unchecked and nobody decided to ask him if he was okay and if he felt in danger. Violence is most often occurring when 2 people both feel like they're threatened.
This is a very, very, deep, sensitive topic.
Absolutely it is, but it's important.
That.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if it's too heavy for listeners, but I really feel like obviously what he did is not right, but that's the difference is you can know that someone's... People talk about the punitive system all the time, that prison isn't what fixes people. We need to talk to them and understand them and help rehabilitate them. Can you not say the same about people who haven't committed crimes yet? Had this man had an open line of dialogue with people on the left or even neutral parties, might have things gone differently? I think yes. And I think that's what the left's message is usually trying to be, but it never ends up that way.
Do you want to talk about ContraPoints?
I would love to talk about ContraPoints. So I'm going to... Those of you who don't know, ContraPoints is an amazing centrist. Or I don't even know if that's what she would define herself as, but that's where I put her because she... Or anyone who can maintain an open dialogue the way she can.
And she has talked a lot about the radicalization of young men.
She has. And one of her points that I really, really love is that there's a lot of people on the far-leaning right that listen to her and then hear some of her arguments and become radical lefts.
Yeah.
Because the problem isn't that they're believing in the wrong political ideology or philosophical belief or anything like that. The problem is they're radical individuals because of their lives that they've had, and they're not contacted and they don't feel accepted, so they seek out groups that will accept them, which are often people who just want another body to throw at the problem.
Yeah.
And that's a real issue, and the left does it too, and I really don't like that people are always talking about alt-right danger and KKK members and all that, when Antifa is just as bad. It is just as bad. The people at the top of it don't view you as an ally. They view you as a body with pepper spray who can go and shut down a rally.
Okay, I think I understand
army.
what you're saying, but I'm going to nitpick it. Because
Okay.
I feel like you could say that Antifa and alt-right are at the same level of danger. I don't think you can compare being a liberal to being part of the KKK.
I didn't compare being a liberal to being part of the KKK.
Okay, just so we're clear.
I compared Antifa to KKK and alt-right members and Wild Boys and all of that. Because that's what they are, in my opinion. They wear body armor and mask and walk around with weapons.
Do you know anyone who's part of Antifa?
I don't think so, but that's the whole point, is that they're anonymous. I don't put myself in situations where I've ever seen an Antifa meet a protest or anything like that, because I don't go to protests. I personally don't think protests do much. The only time protests are successful is when they're riots, as we've seen in Hong Kong. That's what the French Revolution was. It was protests until it was riots. Even women's rights activism had a few good riots before stuff actually went on. So I stay away because all it does is create a dangerous environment for myself, and especially with how radical both sides are nowadays. I don't want to get hit by a car.
Yeah.
But ContraPoints, sorry.
Yeah, ContraPoints, and then...
I would definitely recommend anyone check her out.
Yeah.
Because her channel is pretty amazing. And we both enjoy it together because one of the things we value is dialogue, and she does that very well, I believe. And I really would like to see her start hosting people. because I think that would be amazing.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
But I also don't know how much time she spends editing her videos.
Please host us.
Oh my god, I will fly out to wherever you want to meet.
I think it's
Atlanta?
Washington. I don't remember. It doesn't matter.
Whatever.
So in the discussion of ContraPoints and radicalization and I guess even mental health, we've kind of crossed into that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
If you would like to answer the question of, has there ever been a time when you have felt like your free speech was tampered with or not, or taken away? Your right to use free speech was taken away.
I think I have to go with yes.
Okay.
Even though I don't think there's ever been a time where an individual or even a group intentionally like walked up to me and like shut me up and like prevented me from expressing myself. But I think there have definitely been social situations where I was subconsciously pressured into making myself small and not being involved with the group. Mainly when I was surrounded by large number of people of either different political beliefs, different ethnic groups. Those are the two that come to mind. I can think of two specific situations if you want me to share.
Sure.
But I played football for a very long time, and so there was numerous like parties and get-togethers and that kind of culture. And I can think of a couple of times where just being present in a room, I was just not felt like I was being listened to in any facet or not. Predominantly dominated by young black men. I would make the argument that for a good number of them, like I was as good friends with them as they were with everyone else there, but there was the air of them bonding over something that I could not understand because it couldn't have been football because I did that too, and it couldn't have been camaraderie because I was there too, but there was some aspect. I know a good number of them all lived in the same area, which is a lower class area. A lot of problems going on there. Whereas even though I lived in the same region where I would be on the same team as them because it's a club team, so it's just based on where you live in the city. I live in a relatively nice area near schools, family together. So even though it's only a 5-minute drive or 20-minute walk from where I live, it's a very different environment. But I didn't feel that even basic conversation that I was as aware. And then obviously I don't remember if I've shared this or not yet on here, but as a bisexual man, I've attended Pride on a couple of occasions, and on one occasion was literally just straight up told to leave. Because I was walking through a crowd, I accidentally bumped who I presume is a woman. I'm just gonna call them they because I don't know. But I accidentally bumped her because it's busy as shit there because Pride.
It's a parade.
Yeah, it's a fucking parade. I apologized. Her and a friend started screaming at me, telling me to leave. Said, "Who do you think you are? You don't belong here." Stuff like that. So that's not even my expression. That's just my presence of being allowed to be somewhere where I feel I was absolutely welcome because that is the whole point.
Yeah.
But clearly, it's not a perfect system. And often the people who you're trying to protect are just as closed off as the people who are often viewed as the top, because sense of community is what's important to humans. And if you find people who have lived through similar things as you tend to stick with them. And so that's something that needs to be taken into account, is that, I had the sentence, is that people discriminate inherently. And that's okay. And that didn't make me, well, I mean, the second incident did make me angry because it was absolutely unwarranted. But the first incident, I understand. Like, I get it. I know why it happened now. At the time, it was really annoying. But it didn't make me confrontational. It made me sad that I couldn't be part of a group. But I also understand that there are clearly, and I realize this now, not at the time, there are clearly groups that I was a part of, that other people were a part of, that they did not feel welcome in.
Yeah.
And it's not that we did anything unwelcoming. It's just that they didn't click.
Yeah. Or like the customs are different, or
exactly.
I mean, you can talk about othering. That's very...
If we want to go into the stereotypes of low socioeconomic versus like middle versus high class, there's the handshake, there's the like kind of like high five and clasp each other, and then there's like the fist bump, and there's like the like all sorts of different handshakes, and it's just those are different cultures. And I know those are stereotypes and really dumb, and that's not my point. Yeah. But I'm saying if you go to a fraternity, there's a expected greeting versus if you go to a business meeting. Yeah. They're different groups.
It's a dichotomy for sure.
Yeah. And so it makes people who are unfamiliar with the process feel unwelcome, and that will always happen.
I mean, I feel like there's so much that we can do to bridge that gap, though, and that's really important. And
I think there's so much we can leave alone that will naturally bridge that gap.
I mean, there is, like, I think we've talked about it a little bit before, but there's currently, I think, like, particularly in Ottawa, there is a lot of gatekeeping in the LGBTQ community, and that's a huge problem because...
Aside from myself, I can think of like 2 to 3 other individuals who've been gatekeeped.
Yeah.
And I know you know one.
Yeah, I do, yeah. And it's literally using identity as...
privilege. It's identity as privilege.
And I think that's also something that ContraPoints really talks about. And she talks about unity and how people, because of the trauma they have faced, they seek divisiveness, and that is very true. Like, I can speak to my own experience as someone who identifies as LGBTQ. Like, I mean, a lot of the shifts and transitions that you go through, a lot of the debating and the shame that you feel about your identity, like, that's very real, and I think that's true for most LGBTQ people, especially within history. And to police someone based on the fact that they don't look a certain way, or like, you know, oh, like, you don't act gay or whatever.
Yeah. You don't present gay. You don't you don't pass.
Or even, yeah, like, even especially as a trans person, where it's like, oh, you look this way, so like, how could you be...
Can I like make 2 statements of things that I just like thought of?
Sure.
So like, one, I really think it's important, and it is important to me, to be a bisexual person who does not identify as LGBTQ+.
Okay.
Because there's a difference between being bi and being in that collective. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if there's other individuals out there who need to hear this, but like, you don't have to support Pride to be what they are, because Pride was supposed to support you. And if it's not doing that, then you don't need it.
And they talk about how the first Pride was a riot.
And exactly, riots are what get shit done.
Stonewall.
But the second thing I want to say is people always talk about diversity as strength, but just like, I'm going to use a shitty metaphor here, and I really apologize, but when you work out, you tear your muscles apart to make them stronger. And that's what diversity does, is for the first 30 years, it rips communities apart, it creates divide, it does this, but in the long run, it works. And it builds muscle memory, and it makes things normal. It makes everything capable of doing new things. And that's what's important.
So
you need to accept the rip.
That does make it sound like inherently you do respect people who are fighting for their cultures or their individuality or their group. That does make it sound like you do have respect for people who prove themselves by fighting for what they believe in.
I think people want a mixing pot while also wanting cultural pride and like being allowed to keep your heritage while also identifying as Canadian, which I don't think you can have both. I don't think you can call out people for cultural appropriation when you also want to have a culture that accepts everyone.
Yeah.
You need to pick one. And if you want to pick, you know, every culture being on its own, then you have to realize that there is a culture of people who are here and they don't want you here. And so if you're picking everyone gets to keep their culture, they're going to keep that one.
Yeah.
And that's a really bad thing to want to keep around. If you want to have the mixing pot, they're gonna mix too. That's what it does. But you have to sacrifice your shit so they sacrifice theirs. That's equality. Everyone loses their culture. Because you want to know what we are? We're people. Fuck where you came from. I don't give a fuck who your ancestors are. I give a fuck who you are and what you are now. And if what they did affected you, then it's not that they did it that it affected you. It's that it is you now, because that's part of you. And that's fine. But you don't get to say, well, because I'm from Ethiopia, this. No, it's like, no, you live in Canada. And why'd you come to Canada? Well, you're here. This is why you're here. This is what you are. And that's what's going to become normal. Because it doesn't matter where it's from. It just matters where you live and what you do.
I mean, I feel like in order to address that properly, we need to kind of also address, like, the fact that certain religions like Islam have their own legal and judicial framework, and it's very hard to separate culture from that framework. We don't necessarily have to talk about that.
I don't like religion.
Yeah, we have.
I don't mind if you find your morals and are a good person because of your religion, but religion is one of the strongest us versus them factors there's ever been in the world, because it turns people of different ethnic groups into the same mob, which is unprecedented until it started, but also really radicalizing because it creates the idea of a higher echelon of achievement.
So I hope you can understand when I say, like, I feel like that's more a result of religious institutions and institutions as a whole vying for power. So,
but we just talked about, if a government institutes something, it doesn't matter what its intent was. It matters what actually happens. And so I don't care if their intent was to just better people's lives and bring community. The effect was, we're going to genocide a bunch of people.
Yeah.
And there's only like two religions. There's only like one religion that you can really say never did that, and that's Judaism. Because they've always been the ones getting genocided. Even Buddhism nowadays, there are tons of Buddhist genocides.
You could talk about Israel and Palestine, which is a very controversial subject.
Yes, it is a very controversial subject, and we're not going to talk about that because of how controversial it is, and we need to do a whole video on it if it comes up.
Yeah.
Too. And like there's but that's an us versus them. That's a religious conflict, and that's just evidence enough that, like, if you let us versus them sit, that's what happens. And it's not going to go away. One of those sides is going to win, and unfortunately, we're gonna lose the people who are on the losing side.
I do think that's different from, like, people who practice faith. Like, there's a difference between an institution and an individual.
There's a difference between being spiritual and being a strong religious believer.
Yeah.
I don't mind if you're spiritual to God or to Allah or to any god, but there's a difference between being spiritual towards that and being a religious follower. Which is, that means there is a religious leader somewhere that if they say something, you do it. And that's just like anything. There's a Grand Wizard of the KKK that if he says something, you do it.
Grand Wizard.
It's a great title. I'm really upset that they soiled that with their name, because I would love there to be a government where you could be a Grand Wizard. If only magic were real. Anyways, we're not going to dip into that. But it's really interesting that in one section of the world, Muslims can be genociding Jews, and in another section, Chinese Taos can be genociding Muslims. And then Buddhists can be getting genocided by Muslims in one section and be genociding Muslims in another section. I'm not an Islamophobe. I'm not a Christian phobe. I'm not a Jew phobe. I'm a religiphobe. Yeah. You all fucking scare me. Relax.
I think you're kind of like an
I don't like
agnostic
violence.
Atheist.
Yeah, I don't like violence, and I don't like when groups get together, because that mostly leads to violence. You know, the Crusades didn't happen because, you know, there was like a little bit of beef. They happened because a bunch of people were like, you know what, this would be fun. Let's go kill a bunch of people. And then jihads happened, and they took over like 90% of Spain and a great part of like Greece and like Croatia and like all of there. And that's just what happened. That shit's fucking scary.
That is true. That is true. The world is a little bit scary, but...
The world is very scary.
Alright. So, I think we're gonna end it there.
Oh, we're ending it there?
Is there anything else you want to talk more about?
I mean, nothing like right off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I just like, I really hope that people understand that like I'm not supporting people who say radical things and like discriminate against people. I'm just supporting their ability to have those beliefs and express them. If the punishment is getting culturally shunned, that's fine. I just don't think you can legislate speech.
Yeah. I think ultimately what this is about, and I know that this is like not a very often discussed thing, but it's sort of like if you seek free speech by opposing another person's right to free speech, you become no better than them. And
yes,
there is definitely something to be said for fighting for what you believe in, but that is different from oppression and discrimination.
Yeah.
And
I know we have an episode coming up about reverse racism, and so this is a little bit part of it, but like true equality is not suppressing the people who once suppressed everyone else. It's finding a way to make everyone not suppressed. And that's what free speech is just because these are hate groups that once tormented the world, that suddenly doesn't take away their right to have opinions. What it does is it means that their system didn't work, so we can't copy them. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes you better than them, is the ability to recognize that you don't punish them for that. You make them go away naturally. That's the true punishment.
By being a good person. And by treating people
with respect that they deserve. And you don't give people respect that they don't deserve because that just makes them earn it. Because the one thing people want is respect.
So, with all due respect to all your human ears in all your human places, this has been Some of Us.
And this has been Some of Me.
Yay!
Yay.